In lecture 18, we studied mapping techniques. In lecture 19 series, we will see how texture mapping is performed in OpenGL. We start with the basics first. There are three steps to applying a texture in OpenGL. The first step is to specify a texture. This involves reading an image or generating an image in software, and then assigning that image to be a texture. And next, we enable texture mapping in OpenGL. The second step is to assign texture coordinates to the geometric vertices. This is the mapping part that we studied in the previous lectures. Proper mapping function is left to the application. That means the programmer has to write code that would assign texture coordinates to specific vertex coordinates. The third step is to specify some texture parameters. For example, how should the texture be wrapped around objects, because texture maps are flat whereas geometric objects are 3D. Here we have a simple explanation of texture mapping. This is our geometric object, whereas this is our texture map image, which is a flat image. And we specify the image by two coordinates, which is the S and T. This is a two-dimensional texture image. Our geometry, of course, has three coordinates, the X, Y, and Z. A point on this geometric object is mapped onto a pixel on the image, and this is how we see it on our display. Here is another simple example of mapping a simple texture, that is a 256 by 256 image, onto a square object in OpenGL and looking at the object from a perspective view. Hence, the closer part of the square looks bigger and the part that is further away from the camera looks smaller. The texture size also decreases accordingly in this direction. Images and geometry flow through separate pipelines that join during the fragment processing in OpenGL. Hence, complex textures do not affect geometric complexity. The vertices go through all the geometric pipeline where clipping is performed and perspective projection is performed and interpolation of the vertices is performed, whereas the image flows through the image pipeline, and these two pipelines combine at the fragment processor to produce the desired three-dimensional graphics which have texture mapped on top of them. It is possible to have different resolutions for texture and geometry. Generally, the resolution of geometry is low, whereas the resolution of texture is kept high. This is because texture processing is not as complex as geometric processing. High resolution textures give more realistic appearances. Hence, it is optimal to keep the resolution of the geometry low and the resolution of the texture high to produce more realistic looking surfaces. High resolution textures mapped on low resolution geometry will still look good while being light on the graphics pipeline. Ground textures in your project are perfect examples of this. Here we have only two triangles representing the ground, whereas we see a lot of variations on the ground, and even light changes from here to here. This part is darker, whereas this part is brighter, and we can see bricks on the surface, even though the underlying geometry is a flat surface. Here is an example of specifying a texture image. We define a texture image from an array of texels. Texels basically is a combination of texture elements, and this is done in CPU memory. We can define this as blue byte and give it any name of our choice. Generally, we will keep it something that specifies that these are texels, and then we specify the dimension of the array. Here we have a grayscale 512 by 512 image. We could have had a colored image and we would have an additional dimension that had three values, the red, green, and blue values of the image. We can define this as any other pixel maps. For example, we can get these texel values from a scanned image, or an image taken with a camera, or we can also generate these pixel values from an application program based on some criteria. Next, we enable texture mapping in OpenGL. This is done simply through GL enable, and we enable two-dimensional textures here. Note that OpenGL supports 1 to 4 dimensions, but in this project and in this unit, we'll mainly be using two-dimensional textures. Now we define the image as texture map. We use the GL text image 2D function for this and pass the appropriate parameters to this function. Here is a breakdown of what each parameter means. Target is the type of texture, such as GL texture 2D, which we are going to use mostly in our unit and in the project. Level specifies the mapping level. We will study this later. Components mean the elements per texel to be used. W and H are the height and width of the texels in pixel units. Border is used for smoothing. Format and type basically specify the format and type of the texels. The texels themselves, the last parameter, is a pointer to the texel array. Here is an example usage of the function where we have given specific input arguments. GL text image 2D, the first argument specifies that it's a 2D texture. The second argument specifies the MIP mapping level. We will study this in the next mini lecture. 3 specifies the elements per texel that are used. 5 and 2 by 5 and 2 is the width and height of the texels in pixel units. 0 specifies the smoothing, and we are using RGB format of the image and using the type unsigned byte to store these values. And my texel is the actual pointer to the texel array where the values are stored. Now the typical code to pass these texture coordinates to the vertex shader is given on this slide. We initialize an offset variable from 0, then we specify the vertex positions first and use the program identifier of our vertex and fragment shaders and pass them as attribute locations. This is basically passing the vertex positions. Right, so our elements are 3, which specify the XYZ coordinates of the object in homogeneous coordinates, and we give the buffer offset as 0. Now we update the offset to the size of the points, so it starts ahead of the points, and we initialize another identifier as vtext coordinates, and we pass it as GL attribute location to our vertex shader. Now vtext coordinate will be an in variable in our vertex shader, and then we enable the vertex attribute array with this command, and then we use GL vertex attribute pointer to specify the vtexture coordinates that we have initialized here, and our offset is the new offset that we have updated here.